start this session devoted to the structural analysis of industrialization in Mexico and the global value chains. The presentation of this topic will be given by Dr. Martín Puchet Anyul and José Valentín Solís Arias, both of them from the UNAM. And the commentators after the presentation will be Joaquim Guilhoto of the Sao Paulo University in Brazil and Meng of the Institute of Developing Economics, JETRO. In agreement with the program, the presentation will take half an hour, so that each of the presenters will have 15 minutes. And then we will listen to the comments. And lastly, move into the question and answer session. I will give the floor then to Dr. Martín Puchet Anyul, who is UNAM professor at the Faculty of Economics in the postgraduate division, with very important publications. The most recent ones are Mexico Beyond NAFTA and New Tools of Economic Dynamics. So let's hear Martín Puchet, and then we will give the floor to Valentín Solís. All right. Valentín will make the presentation of the work, and I will participate specifically in the questions and answers to the comments. Good day to everybody. Thank you very much for your presence and for your valuable time. I appreciate the NEGI and the UNAM, the institutions who invited me to this presentation. And we're going to go straight into topic. I'm going to make my presentation in Spanish, although the texts are in English, which will facilitate the reading of our guests. This work was motivated as a way to find different pathways to analyze the association between the Mexican industrialization and the insertion of our country into the global value chains. We know this quite well, those of us that have been living in Mexico since the mid-80s, who have been experiencing an insertion of our economy into the international market. Undoubtedly, this was a response that was deeper in the 90s and has recently taken on a new dynamics with the new international events and the so-called globalization. Through our import substitution, there was a thread that was led by the Mexican state. By the mid-80s, we thought the best thing would be to make reforms where the Mexican government was led by the market. So this started in the mid-80s, and the first peak of this process was the signature of a free trade agreement with the USA and Canada. This was seen by many from different points of view. Some people were afraid that this would imply a deindustrialization process in our country, that we would be more deeply subjected to the American economy, whereas others saw it in a more positive way, because we would have access to broader markets, introduce processes with economies of large scale, and so on and so forth. So we could integrate in a better way into the most developed aspect of the economy. Years after the signature of this agreement, our country has suffered a deep stagnation, a mass growth of unemployment, a greater distortion in income distribution, which became polarized, and we have to look for responses at a structural level. Our macroeconomic analysis is not enough. We have macroeconomic stability, and everybody says that what we need to do is to correct the micro aspects, but I think that microeconomy is a result of what is happening at a structural and micro level. So we have made attempts to make use of the techniques of mesoeconomics to go further in this analysis, to further this analysis. So we're going to go over some of the tools that we're using. Some are very conventional tools, and we will measure things that are of public domain today, the vertical specialization, the generation of aggregated value for exportations. But we're going to try to associate this to some measurements of the the domestic economy. So we're also going to do a methodological journey, step by step, from very simple input-output matrices with conventional coefficients to dichotomize these matrices, the flow matrices, and to apply the network theory for dichotomic graphs, and later put them in valued digraphics and directed digraphics, where asymmetry is more evident. So we're going to have 4 sets of matrices, 2 of coefficient matrices and 2 flow matrices. And we're going to exploit the information coming out of both the coefficient and the flow matrices. The latter are usually you have to normalize in order to export some kind of information. We're going to attack the problem in another way. We're going to do double measurements of purchases and sales with one figure only, i.e., figures that have 2 dimensions, purchases on the one hand and sales on the other. So if there are figures in 2 dimensions and each one says one number only, we immediately are in the area of complex numbers. Funny concept. These are numbers with 2 dimensions. So we're going to create matrices with 2 dimensions with complex numbers, and we're going to draw information into that kind of matrices directly in relation to the flows and without making any standardization or pre-process in these kind of matrices. So I will therefore proceed step by step from the coefficient matrices, and then I will go into the flow matrices, and we're going to see what kind of results are given by them. This corresponds to matrices that associate the domestic aggregated value contained in exportations and the value of imports contained in our exports. These are 2 measurements that I could call conventional because they've been distributed by several groups of researchers in the last 3 years, especially the ones that have produced the World Input-Output database that associates more than 40 countries through input-output matrices and account for more than 80% of the worldwide trade. Within these kind of matrices, included within this conception of world matrices, 2 Latin American countries are comprised, Brazil and Mexico.
So we'll have the opportunity to take this information and see the differences between Mexico and Brazil. We'll also be able to create, to see the contrast between 2 interesting economies. The Korean economy, which is very interesting, it's a prototype in terms of successful integration into the world processes. On the other hand, we will also contrast 2 other economies, 2 developed economies that have different strategies for industrialization and integrating their economies into the global market, the U.S. and Germany. So we'll be comparing 5 economies: Mexico, Brazil, Korea, Germany, and the United States. Okay. So the first measure we are going to take in order to analyze the internal structure of the country is the first measure developed by Swordlander in the 70s. And I'd like to say that, well, somebody wrote about this, and I was surprised of the new depth given to this simple measurement. He developed a circularity index, which basically states that within a input-output matrix, products can return to the place of origin that developed them. This is more clear in a closed model in which consumption refeeds the matrix. If we follow Professor Hewis's formula, this is the only way to have full circularity within an economy. So we have income generation, payment, then distribution of the income, and then consumption again. And then the saving and investment circuit, that would be a context, but we'll take an indicator which is very simple. This circularity coefficient is just a coefficient in which we associate the Leontief's, which is 1 minus a, because some of them, when they say Leontief matrix, they think of the other way, the inverted model, and that's how we get this coefficient. And the denser the it states is the denser the arcs that relates it to a graph, the larger it is, the better integrated the economy is. And it's more complex than what it than what you can see here. But with CI, you have for 97 and 2007, you take this baseline for 1997 and 2007, because these were years in which international cycles weren't gravitating because of the tequila effect or the 2008 financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis. So we discovered that 2 years that could be studied in relative stability were 1997 and 2007. All data were taken from the World Input-Output Database. So we took the input-output matrices for these countries, and we obtained a circularity quotient. And for Germany, we have well, it's not normalized, so take it as a cardinal number, 13. Then second would be Brazil, which would be 21.2. Korea, 50.93. The U.S., 28.54. And Mexico, 5.97. It's notable that the economy, which is the best integrated, is the Korean, then the Brazilian, for that year specifically, then the U.S., Germany, and Mexico in the last place. This would be the circularity quotient. What happens 10 years later? The German economy integrates better, passes to 14.8. Brazil disintegrates a bit, passes from 21 to 16.8 for 2007. Korea continues its integration from 50 to 110. The U.S. also drops to 18, and Mexico drops as well. On the right hand, you can see the growth rates for this indicator. At the same time, on the right hand, we have something which is VS, which is vertical specialization, which basically refers to I'll just check the formulas. These are the formulas. Vertical specialization is to take the inverse Leontief matrix and multiply it by an export vector and divide it by the total of exports. So it's the direct and indirect context of imports required to export. And on the other hand, we have another measurement, which is added value required for or generated for exports, which is the inverse Leontief matrix multiplied by the added value vector and the export vector divided by the total of exports. So the total of added value required by the economies to export, and the other is the required amount of imports to export. Okay, so I go back to the previous slide. Okay, vertical specialization. Let me check these numbers. In Germany, it's 11.3 for 97, and for 2007, it's 17.43. For Brazil, 5.58, 97. And it grows. Korea passes from 19.5 to 25.15, and the U.S. goes from 6.29 to 8.61. We can say that the U.S. is more self-sufficient. The U.S. is a huge country and can obtain resources from within, but its import needs to export are low. In the case of Mexico, import needs for export are close to 15%, 14.29 in 97 and 14.7 in 2007. The growth rates are on the side. So what relation is between integration at the domestic level and international or global integration? These are just small sample. This is a small sample. It's just 2 years, but I'll leave it at this. Okay, so I have the case observations, and okay, the two coefficient matrices related to these indicators. Well, let's calculate them. Do you have a pointer? Sorry. Okay, I just want you to see that on the second line, this here, okay, oh. These are two matrices. The second line, this is a coefficient matrix, a quotient matrix, and this is another one. This one's associated to the quotients that operate for the vectors. So, but these are matrices. So what we did was something very simple. To these matrices, we just determined the marginals, like Rasmussen, so we added the columns, and then we have the numbers by sector. So we can create a hierarchy of this, and that's exactly what we did for both matrices. We've seen that these matrices are complementary. VS plus VA, vertical specialization, and the added value generation needs add 1. You can't see this here, but the sum is 1. So it's a very simple identity. Intermediate, consumption, added value, value of the production, you obtain the quotients and you add them, and these two indicators will add 1. So we obtained the marginals, and then we did a hierarchy of the sectors per country, and we obtained a rank correlation Well, we used Spearman, we could have used Kendall, so the correlation between the vectors was calculated between the countries. And then what we discovered was that, let me read the comments. Between what we have in between 1 year and the other, there were no modifications. If there were no modifications, the correlation is very similar. The quotient is similar, but if they change, there are changes to the structure, and if one is moved out, there's an inverse relation. Well, basically, this is just to compare the types of economies that are surging from this kind of specialization. The ones that are most similar among them are Mexico and Brazil, but with inverse hierarchies. Economies such as the U.S. economy and the Korean and the German economies, they will all be much more similar. And this would be an exploration between these quotients, and because we'd like to find types of countries related to this. Then we'd have a next stage. We'll go beyond the quotients associated to the matrices. So let's take flows. These matrices. If I take these matrices, okay, this should be enough. Okay. If I use a diagonal matrix for experts, I have a diagram without flows. And if I do the same here, then I have both matrices without flows, which would be imports and flows required directly or indirectly by the economy, sector by sector. Same happens with added value needs. So I would be removing this operator, which is what generates the sum. So it would only be this matrix here times the diagonal one. So we would have them without the flows. And from here, I can extract the information directly. So these flow matrices can be made binary, and then we have, yes, a dichotomized chart, and then we use network theory. There's three basic ones. One is called by degrees, by proximity, and the third, which is proximity or centralness by intervention. We can determine sectors within the matrix that connect or link the flows moving from one block to the other, and which play an important role as mediators. It's not that they have a large operational volume associated to them, but they serve as bridges between the sectors. So let's imagine that we have 2 points that need to be connected in a network, two knots or two nodes. There's an intermediate. If an intermediate connects one and another, then it's a link. But they can also link to others and others. So we can see how many times a single sector can be an intermediate connecting, whether bilaterally or input-output. So through our count of how many times these branches or countries are used as a bridge, we can obtain a hierarchy of the importance of these intermediate branches. So here are the results. They are basically, depending on the country, it says press a button and I press another one. Machinery for Germany, then construction as services because it's non-commercial. Then we have electricity, gas, and we have a hierarchy. Well, I'm running out of time, so I'll go fast. Here's a hierarchy of the sectors that play as intermediaries in added value needs or export and import needs. So now we go to the graphs. In the case of the value graphs, we're taking the flow matrix, and then we add an operator and a transpose matrix, which would be I of the complex numbers. So this is a complex number matrix. We rotate them and we make them octagonal, and that's what we're doing. It's a way in which we make a matrix symmetrical. It's very complex, but all information is symmetrical. But then we have purchases and sales in each of its parts. So we have a symmetrical matrix and all the theorems which we're aware of multivariant statistics are applied. In other words, this has zeros on the diagonals. There's no transactions with itself. It's not reflexive. So there's zeros on the diagonals, and it guarantees certain properties. All the self-vectors, or self-values, are real. And the sum is zero. If we do them, we can also obtain the variance of main components if we do the square root. And the next parts are complex, but they are unique. So we can create a split of the complex numbers, the vectors and the self-vectors, and on one hand have the real part, and on the other the imaginary one, but expressed as a radian, in such a way that we have the size of the vector in its direction, and then we can interpret this, and that's exactly what we did. And here we have some results. Here we have the arithmetics of the numbers, but let me just tell you the results. It turns out that seen as a flow matrix without net requirements, without import requirements, Germany requires metals, transportation equipment, machinery for recycling, optical and electrical equipment, mining, and quarrying. Brazil requires mining, so does Korea, the US, and Mexico doesn't. All economies require the import of metals. Then all the economies also require petroleum, carbon, and nuclear fuel. All except Mexico and Germany. In other words, countries such as Brazil, Korea, and the United States are not importing as theory states many manufactured goods in order to export. They're exporting raw materials, basically mining and oil-related products. It's all this story about segments would have to be revised. Results show something different. The only economies that are importing manufactured goods are Mexico and Germany. And Mexico doesn't, well, because of natural resources, doesn't require it, but it seems we're returning to an old model. Countries such as Korea, the US, and possibly others are exporting manufactured goods and importing raw materials, and we are importing semi-produced manufactured goods, and then we are finishing them here and exporting them on. And I'm not very satisfied with these results, but I wanted to share them with them. And hopefully, well, finally, that we have enough comments to obtain new information and and stay true to the spirit of this, which is a workshop and not a conference cycles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentín. We will now hear the comments by Professor Joaquim Guilhoto of the Sao Paulo University in Brazil, currently guest professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning of the MIT, where he also participates in the joint program on the science and policy of global change at the MIT too. Professor Joaquim Guilhoto, we will hear you. I want to appreciate having been invited to participate in this workshop, to Paulo, to the UNAM and INEGI. I speak a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish, so I'm going to speak. Pueden ver que mi portuñol no es bueno, así que si no les importa, voy a cambiar al inglés porque me siento más cómodo usando el inglés, a pesar de que el español y el portugués son muy parecidos. Tengo que reconocer que mi español es bastante malo, ustedes disculpen. Quiero agradecer a Pablo y a los organizadores por esta invitación a participar en esta reunión. Siempre es bueno regresar a México. Estuve aquí la primera vez invitado por parte del la profesora Josefina Calico, que está aquí. Qué bueno ver amistades aquí presentes. Ahora, regresando a la ponencia, al artículo, creo que la ponencia es un muy buen punto de partida, pero tengo algunas preguntas con respecto a esta ponencia. Cuando la leí, me parece que algunas de las cuestiones fueron aclaradas en la presentación misma, ya que lo que yo leí fue una versión preliminar, pero aún así tengo unos comentarios que me gustaría realizar y quiero recibir ideas de los presentadores con respecto a lo que yo planteo. Una de las preguntas que están discutiendo en la ponencia que no se mencionó aquí fue la cuestión de la desindustrialización. Y veo que la desindustrialización, mucha gente se refiere a ella y del efecto sobre la cadena de valor agregado, pero quizás las economías crecen, el tamaño de las industrias, el tamaño relativo de la industria decrementa, así que no lo veo como un problema en sí mismo y en cierta forma la cuestión de la cadena de valor agregado, si ayuda a aumentar el Producto Interno Bruto, no lo veo como un problema tampoco. Así son cuestiones que no se mencionaron en la ponencia que sería muy interesante abordar. La pregunta es, ¿cuál es la meta del país? ¿Que crezca el Producto Interno Bruto o cuál? Si puedes conseguir resultados a través de la cadena de valor, no hay problema entonces. Hay mucha discusión de esto, no nada más en México, sino también en Brasil, y también hay que esperar a ver los resultados finales. Si son buenos, sigamos por ese camino. Es otra cuestión que no enfrentan en la ponencia, es la cuestión del comercio nacional en comparación al comercio internacional. En la región mexicana es más importante la economía doméstica, el comercio doméstico que el comercio internacional. Creo que debería ser una pregunta a ser planteada dentro de esta ponencia. Tengo otra pregunta son preguntas generales que voy a hacer posteriormente, pero con respecto a la ponencia misma, no estoy de acuerdo con los comentarios finales y resultados que usted presenta. No me parece que los resultados de su análisis realmente articulan la cuestión de la exportación y los contenidos de importación en las exportaciones, sino que hay que ver si los sectores centrales de la economía de estos países están relacionados con esto. Así que quizás me equivoque, pero viendo los datos de la economía brasileña, yo no veo a Brasil como un importador de bienes minerales, de combustibles fósiles y otras cosas. Cuando veo la relación de estos sectores en mi análisis de la economía brasileña, esos son sectores principales que son más representativos de la economía brasileña misma. Así que no estoy de acuerdo con los resultados que ustedes muestran, que están relacionados con las importaciones, sino que más bien están relacionados con los sectores claves de la economía. Así que me gustaría que comentaran un poco sobre eso, porque los resultados que presentan van en contra de lo que yo siento está sucediendo en las economías, por lo menos en el caso de la economía de Brasil. Así que quizás haya algún problema ahí en la teoría que ustedes aplicaron. En términos de la ponencia misma, la forma en que está escrita es una cuestión de estilo, pero me gusta la estructura que tiene introducción, metodología y resultados y el problema, y no todo mezclado, porque a veces cuando se mezcla todo se pierde la idea, porque están hablando del problema, luego mezclan la metodología y luego los resultados. Es una sugerencia que se estructura de esta forma. También me gustaría ver en la ponencia, como una sugerencia, como siguen trabajando sobre esta ponencia, me gustaría ver una comparación con otros estudios que usan otras metodologías para mostrar en qué forma la metodología que ustedes presentan puede ser mejorada en relación a las otras metodologías que se presentan en la literatura. En general, esos serían mis comentarios generales. Gracias. Thank you, Professor Guilhoto. We'll now hear Professor Meng, who is Deputy Director in the International Input-Output Analysis Studies Group in the Development Study Center. He has an MA of the Yamaguchi University and a PhD in Information Sciences from the Tohoku University. We give you the floor, Professor Meng. Gracias, presidente de la mesa, moderador. Gracias a los organizadores y a los que estuvieron involucrados en esta conferencia tan interesante. Disculpen que no puedo hablar español, solo inglés.
Just a moment ago, because before yesterday, I did got the paper. So it's my first.
Es la primera vez que veo esta ponencia y me parece que es una ponencia muy interesante porque en este campo hay ciertas direcciones. Por ejemplo, sabemos que hay toda una discusión sobre la cadena global de valores y hay también temas que tienen que ver con la industrialización, y esta ponencia liga estos dos temas y nos muestra un panorama muy interesante. También pienso que otras cosas interesantes es que esta ponencia usa frases nuevas como la circularidad, el uso del vector, que los economistas no están tan familiarizados. Es una metodología nueva que nos puede mostrar de forma muy rápida y directa una imagen de la economía. Sobre todo, este nuevo método que se aplicó aquí nos muestra con información muy importante el impacto sobre la economía. Me parece que hay otro punto muy bueno en esta, y también tengo comentarios y preguntas, siguiendo las preguntas del profesor Guilhoto. Ustedes saben que recientemente muchos países Están hablando de la exportación del valor agregado y la Organización Mundial del Comercio, la OCDE y el Banco Mundial también construyen sus propios bases de datos con tablas internacionales. Es una tabla internacional. Han publicado muchos indicadores recientemente como la Organización Mundial del Comercio publicó datos sobre diferentes países individuales. También tiene su propio indicador sobre el valor agregado. Esta ponencia tiene muchas conexiones con la base de datos, como el uso de el indicador famoso de la especialización vertical. Los datos provienen de las tablas nacionales más que de las internacionales. No es así, porque si vemos las ecuaciones de esta ponencia, está mencionando una fórmula. En este tipo de ecuación, las importaciones intermediarias es una variable exógena, porque los productos intermediarios importados es bastante complicada esta ecuación, así que quizás sería mejor mejorar la ponencia para usar el análisis internacional. Es muy bueno que esta ponencia muestre la relación entre la industrialización y los indicadores de la especialización. Otro punto importante que quiero plantear. Recientemente tuvimos información basada en la base de datos de la OCDE y nos permite entender que casi todas las economías a partir del 95 hasta el 2000 y pico, los contenidos de importación de la exportación han subido mucho. En el caso de Singapur es casi un 5% de aumento y en el caso de China es del 19 al 29%. En Japón es de un 8 a un 12%. Para todos los países este porcentaje ha subido mucho. Esto quiere decir que el valor agregado de las exportaciones va a descender. Sin embargo, desde otro punto de vista, cuando hacemos cálculos sobre el aumento del valor agregado en las exportaciones y del aumento en el Producto Interno Bruto, vemos que aumenta mucho más rápido el valor agregado que el Producto Interno, el PIB. También el nivel de destreza sube mucho más, va aumentando más. Ese nivel está aumentando cada vez más, pero el valor agregado es otra historia. Muchos países en vías de desarrollo toman ventaja de esta composición de la cadena de valor. Sin embargo, esta ponencia no menciona cuando vemos la relación entre un país y otro. Tenemos que ver también la relación entre firma entre compañía y compañía, porque no hay información sobre la propiedad de las compañías en este análisis. Si vemos esta actividad de las multinacionales, por ejemplo, ellos están haciendo una actividad fragmentada y el jugador central de la cadena de valor global son estas firmas, así que quizás sería bueno ligar los datos de estas firmas, de estas compañías, junto con los datos nacionales y la industrialización. Ese es mi comentario. Me gustaría decir que sería bueno actualizar esta ponencia, es bastante interesante porque es un análisis interdisciplinario. Gracias.
Gracias, profesor.
Thank you, Professor Meng. Well, we have a presentation, a very stimulating presentation, a very provocative presentation, I would say, that has deserved two very interesting and timely comments by our colleagues from Brazil and Japan. We have 15 minutes left to give the floor to the rest of you. However, I wonder, and I asked Professor Puchet whether this would be the moment for him to intervene, or he wants to intervene in the afternoon. So we'll listen to Professor Puchet before giving the floor to the audience. I'm going to try to make some considerations regarding the comments as briefly as possible. Of course, that I coincide with all the formal considerations that the commentators made. This is a work in progress, and of course, it will have the structure of a paper with the location of the problem, methodology, and results, as we habitually do. Allow me to explain what was the motivation underlying this paper and why we made this presentation in three small segments showing the results and mixing it with methodology. The intention was that the discussion regarding industrialization processes has had, in general, two different lines. One line that says what happened in countries like Mexico that had a very lengthy phase of industrialization by import substitution, and then a whole set of market reforms that led to a very high degree of integration of a Mexican economy into the U.S. economy. But in the end, at the end of this process, which was an integration process in specific segments of the chains that cross North America, the results from the point of view, as Valentín noted, of growth and income distribution were not the results that were expected. So our glance is to try to understand what new structure was generated within this economy integrated in North America, so that we can make some conjectures or to set forth some hypotheses regarding our growth issues and income distribution issue. Stagnated growth and highly unequal income distribution throughout the period of integration after the pro-market reforms. The other line is to present the industrialization process in Korea as of the 70s onwards as a process led by exports and as a successful process. Thus, we are interested in comparing from the structural point of view and from the incorporation of these national structures into the chain values to incorporate these two cases. And then we said it is important for us to consider the Brazilian case that is always compared with Mexico, contrasted with Mexico, and the leading cases, which are in America, the USA, in Europe, Germany, and which are our two main areas of trade, increasingly important areas of trade for Mexico. Also, the Southeastern Asian for Mexico, especially in terms of imports. That was the motivation of this paper. Now, the idea was to say, let's take 2 years to see a structural change process, a long-term structural change process. We have the series of the matrices, but we use the ones from 97 and 2007 because of the relative stability, economic stability of these 2 years in relation to the two crisis periods in the 90s and the 2000s. And let's try to see what was the change within the articulation structure of these economies with the whole of the international economy. that analysis can be made with the global matrix, with the worldwide matrix. However, we have to use a recent Leisenbacher result. We made an analysis based on the domestic matrices and the indicators regarding the import structure, because the specialization, vertical specialization, is equivalent in the case of a multi-sectoral and multi-country matrix than doing what we did. That is the demonstration of the Leisenbach article. So the process, the global process of linking the trade structure and the inter-industrial structures obviously should take into account the whole of the global matrix. But as what we were interested in was a comparative analysis of very specific aspects, we decided to make this analysis based on the information that we have presented. The other issue might perhaps be an issue, a methodological issue in the following sense. Why do we use these three methodologies? Why did we choose these three methodologies? We thought in the following terms. We needed to do a comparison based on the conventional chain measurements. That's why we use the Generally Watanabe Transmission Index, and we ordered the sectors and we compared the structures with that index, which is more conventional. And obviously what we're seeing here is exclusively the point referring to the link between the economies with the rest of the world. In other words, we're exclusively looking at those matrices that Valentín referred to. There is another glance, which is the glance on the relationship between the internal structure and the trade structure. That is obviously of crucial importance for the industrialization process, but we were interested in placing the emphasis on that concept, which was how the weight of integration on the export process through the import process of intermediate inputs, and that's what we did, and we're going to do the same thing with the added value. The second aspect is this idea of the key sectors. Obviously, these key sectors are not the key sectors of the industrial structure of each of these countries. These are the key sectors exclusively on the specific point of the interaction of that economy with the rest of the world, of each of these 5 economies with the rest of the world. And what we're measuring is the degree of importance in terms of the intermediary or the centrality terms regarding these exchanges that are the ones that allow the economies to integrate into the segments of the global chains in each one of the cases. That was the perspective which explains why we chose these 3 different methodologies. I want to deeply appreciate the comments that we received, and I suppose that Valentín might have something to add. Let's give the floor to the participants over there. Professor Moreno.
Well, first of all, I'm Juan Pablo Moreno from the ECLAC, and well, congratulations to the INEGI and the UNAM for this workshop. And I'd like to ask you if, on this work, which is a work in progress, could you possibly answer if, in the case of the Mexican economy, the issue of deindustrialization and the penetration of exports relate to the deindustrialization or towards the internal market, or well, some people who don't speak of input-output say it has to do with exports generating more imports, but some of us and some of you say that there's also a deindustrialization within the chains that produce for the internal market. Could you give us perhaps any information on this or an opinion? Anyone else? No? Okay. Gracias por la información tan interesante. Me pregunto si los resultados que han obtenido, bueno, han estado estudiando el pasado, y mi pregunta es si lo que han aprendido sobre el pasado nos da pistas de lo que podría ser deseable como estrategia de desarrollo a futuro. Well, if we have no further questions, there's a question back here. Just with regards to the subject, I just want to elaborate on it, and I'd like to ask if you have any additional information or data with regards to the new commercial treaties and the trade strategies for different countries, and if there's any impact on the integration into global value chains through the free trade agreements that the country has. Soy Terry Barker de Inglaterra, y una de las cosas que noté entre los 5 países siendo comparados es que México y Estados Unidos tienen una frontera muy grande y los demás países no tienen una frontera, y esto significa que el comercio de los otros países tiene que pasar por mar y por tierra, perdón, por mar y por barco, y esto tiene una diferencia esto tiene efectos en los costos de transportación, y me pregunto si ustedes han interpretado la diferencia que podría existir por esta relación entre México y Estados Unidos y México y los demás países. Okay, so Valentín, please, and Martín Puchet. Well, I'd like to just comment on what Professor Guilhoto has said, something very briefly. It's that when you analyze the importance of imports for the generation of new imports to export, which is what's being said, for me to export, I need to import things from outside, and this will have repercussions on the national market. And this refers to using imports, and I can bring technology, etc., and everything that we've seen in the WTO and the the OECD, and what we show here is a matrix that's working with flows, where the size of the exports matter. It's not normative, such as when we do normalizations, the Cheney, Watanabe, and Rasmussen normalization, because as Rasmussen said, all industries have the same rights at that moment. When we work on a flow matrix and we obtain information from it through this method, and we have this hierarchization of sectors, whether directly or indirectly, and the size of the imports, the flows. So this gives us an absolutely different perspective. The size matters, basically. So the way in which we order it is like this. We take the information not as it comes on the database. We don't add anything to it. And I'd like to say that we don't consider anything institutional in terms of treaties As somebody mentioned, that's the first thing we consider. The second is that we don't have answers except very fragmentarily of what the relation of internal industrialization and exports are, and this is we're just experimenting with this information. We're basically learning more about it, and I agree with Professor Meng that it's very important to do these measurements in the context of an inter-country matrix. I don't expect to find huge differences in the coefficients because it's been proven that the vertical silo of different countries is equivalent to do it country by country, but we don't have the added value of other countries for my own exports, and that necessarily has to be calculated in an inter-country matrix. And many of the indicators mentioned by Professor Meng are based on this interaction between added value commerce in both directions, what I send and what I receive, and that's not what this document is achieving, and we'll try and obtain this in the context of an inter-country matrix. So we can't give answer to Professor Moreno's answer because, as I said, this is not yet very formalized. The interaction between the domestic economy and the influence it's received from outside through its integration into value-added chains. I'd like to add two things. One, that together with other methodologies, we have analysis. We're conducting analysis to see how institutional factors could be introduced into global chain analysis, specifically when it comes to products. There's a group working with the ECLAC in Santiago to do this and to try and determine if agreements or commercial agreements signed by countries can alter the relation between these two countries in terms of output. And if we try and elucidate the future, an important factor to consider is we can have a matrix of a relationship with the United States and between both economies, in which we consider the transportation costs, because a central aspect is, of course, this interaction between two economies whose main characteristic is that they are neighbors, and this becomes a determining factor about anything we say about industrial relationships between the countries and mutual exports and imports. And I think this is an additional issue from value-added chains, and in the case we have neighboring economies. Well, thank you, Valentín, Solís, and Martín, Puchet, and Mr. Guilhoto and Meng for their comments on this interesting session. And I'd like to thank you for your discipline as well with regards to the time, which means we have a right to a cup of coffee and nice break right now.